Hello, and welcome to Untwisted Threads. This is a swatch using Cascade 220. And so is this. And so is this. How can that be? These swatches are so different in size. In today's video, we're going to be using 3 different needle sizes to make swatches with the same yarn, and maybe we'll be able to see if there's a difference in yardage of yarn used. Maybe we'll find out if using a larger or smaller needle size on your project, if you'll use more or less yarn. Maybe you can even save some money by using a different needle size and buying less yarn for your project. Let's find out. So we're using Cascade 220, which is a worsted weight and a workhorse of a yarn. We'll leave our review for this yarn in the description if you're interested in checking it out. The suggested needle size for this yarn is 4 to 5 millimeter needles, so we're going to make a swatch with 5 millimeter, but also a swatch using 3.5 millimeter and another swatch using 6.5 millimeter needles. To keep it consistent, I'm knitting each of my swatches with 12 stitches across and 15 rows. So starting with the recommended needle size, why is the recommended needle size important? Do you have to use it? And the answer is no. Recommended needle size is just a suggestion. Like every knitter, the tension of every knitter is different. So I like to think of the recommended needle size as a starting point for your gauge. There are different times and reasons that you may go up or down in your needle size for your projects. Maybe you're a tight or a loose knitter. Maybe you're knitting color work. Usually you go up a needle size for that, or even as simply as knitting ribbing for the collar of your sweater. So why might you want to use the recommended needle size? Let's think about drape for a second. A smaller needle size will have more tension and less drape. A larger needle size will do the opposite and have a lot more drape. But if you're wanting something right in the middle, that's where the recommended needle size comes in. Lately, I have loved using the same needle size for my sweater, like the Aspyn Sweater here, as I use for the hem and cuff ribbing because it gives an oversized and more cozy feel in my opinion. Alright, it's time to knit a swatch with the smaller 3.5 millimeter needles. When I think of smaller needles, it makes me think of ribbing. Oftentimes designers go down one needle size from the main needle size of their projects to make the collar, cuffs, and hem smaller and have a closer fit to your body. Say you're knitting using a 4 millimeter needle size for the body. It's probably recommended by the designer for you to use a 3.5 or an even 3 millimeter needle for your ribbing. Ribbing can be used in so many different ways, like this pair of socks. I love using ribbing for socks because it creates a closer fit to my foot. So I've mostly seen ribbing used to create a closer fitting garment with negative ease because it allows the garment to fit and stretch really nicely. So overall, by using a smaller needle size, your stitch count will more than likely go up and you'll have less space in between your stitches. Okay, so it's time for the larger 6.5 millimeter needles. I like having a little bit more drape for my garments, so I'll typically go up slightly from the recommended needle size given on a yarn label. This needle size is a little bit on the larger extreme end, but I think it will really show you the difference that a larger needle size can make. For example, I like to use DK weight yarn, and that typically recommends a 4 millimeter needle size. I like to use a 4.5 millimeter needle because it just gives a little bit of extra drape, but not so much that there are holes or the fabric is see-through. One project that comes to mind when I think of using a larger needle size is this Monna sweater. This is a project using fingering weight yarn that uses a 4.5 millimeter needle size, which is much larger than the recommended 2.5 millimeter needle size used for fingering weight yarn. I think the combination of the smaller yarn, larger needle size, and the lace is an absolutely beautiful combination. It really makes those lace stitches stand out. Okay, so our swatches are blocked and finished, and I can already see quite a bit of difference in swatch sizes, but let's go ahead and measure them and figure out their gauges. So using the 3.5mm needles, our swatch measures 2.5 inches wide by 2.25 inches tall, giving us a gauge of about 18 stitches by 28 rows per 4 inches. Now for the 5mm needles, which is the suggested needle size for this yarn. Our swatch looks like it is 3.25 inches wide by 2.75 inches tall, giving us a gauge of about 16 stitches per 24 rows in 4 inches. And now for the 6.5mm needles. Our swatch measures 3.75 inches wide by 3.25 inches tall, giving us a gauge of about 14 stitches and 20 rows in 4 inches. Now, what I'm really curious about is how much each of these swatches weigh. To do this, I'm going to use this little digital scale measuring each of the swatches' weight in grams. Before we see the measurements, I'd love to hear your guess. Which swatch and needle size do you think weighs the most and would use the most amount of yarn for a blanket? The 3.5mm, the 5mm, or the 6.5mm needle size? Leave your guess in the comments. So first, the 3.5mm swatch weighs 2.153 grams. The second swatch with the 5mm needles weighs 2.562 grams. And lastly, the 6.5mm swatch weighs 2.933 grams. Now, by the weight of these swatches, we know that the 6.5mm swatch used the most amount of yarn. But just hang on a moment because I have a little bit of explaining to do. So what does all of this information tell us? Yes, on this small scale, the smallest needle size weighs the least and uses the least amount of yarn. But instead of these swatches being the same stitch and row count, let's make them into the same size of a baby blanket, or 45 inches by 60 inches. So instead of measuring how many stitches across and rows, we're going to measure to the same length and width size. We're going to get into a little bit of math right here, so bear with me because I think you'll be really surprised at the difference in answers for each needle size. We're first going to need the weight of our swatch, height and width measurements, and the height and width measurement of our desired blanket, which is 45 inches by 60 inches. We'll also need the weight of our skein and the cost, and for this yarn that we're using, it's $12 for a 100-gram skein. Let's first get our desired square inches of the blanket. We will multiply the 45 inches wide by 60 inches long and get 2,700 square inches. So we will take the weight of our swatch divided by the width of the swatch times the height of the swatch, and all of that multiplied by the square inches of our blanket. Then we will divide that number by the total weight of each skein and round up to get how many skeins we'll need. Then we will multiply that number by the cost of each skein. So we're going to take the information we have to find X, or how many grams of yarn it would take per needle size to make a baby blanket. Starting with a 3.5mm needle, the weight of the swatch is 2.153 grams. Divide that by the square inches of the swatch, which is 2.5 inches, multiplied by 2.25 inches, and all of that multiplied by our desired square inches, which is 2,700 inches. Are you with me so far? That gets us a weight of 1,033.44 grams. Now we're going to divide that number by 100 grams, which is the weight of a single skein, and round that up to needing a total of 11 skeins. 11 skeins at $12 each brings us to $132 to make the baby blanket with 3.5mm needles. For the 5mm needles, we will end up needing 773.97 grams, rounded up to 800 grams, which is 8 skeins. And that brings us to a cost of $96 to make the same blanket. And for the finale, the 6.5mm needles, by rounding up, you will end up needing 7 skeins and a total cost of $84 to make the baby blanket. So yes, when we weighed our swatches, the 3.5mm swatch weighs the least, but you will end up needing more stitches per inch and therefore use more yarn. So looking at all of that math, here is my tip. If you can comfortably go up a needle size or 2 and adjust your pattern accordingly, yes, you can save money and use less yarn. I would love to hear your thoughts after hearing all of that math and numbers. I was shocked at the price difference between using a 3.5mm needle of $132 and using a 6.5mm needle with a cost of $84. That is a savings of $48. And not to mention the time you'll be saving by using a larger needle size too. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time.